The Mormon Church starts out in New York and included a lot of the Smith neighbors and associates in the area. But Joseph sent out missionaries, and some missionaries went to Ohio. In that process, they converted a Campbellite minister named Sidney Rigdon. And Rigdon was able to get a majority of his congregation to come into Mormonism. So at that point, Smith moves the whole church out to Kirtland, Ohio, and also a contingent to Independence, Missouri, where they're trying to set up Zion, the true community of God.
He's gaining converts left and right. They get to the point where they want to build a temple. They need to raise money because the temple is going to cost a lot of money. They form a bank.
But he can't get a charter for it. So when he publishes his money, the Kirtland Safety Society banknotes, he has to go back and retype over the banknotes that it's an anti-banking establishment because they don't have a charter.
For a guarantee on all of that money that they take in, Joseph Smith prints out $3 and $4 bills, and he issues them out as currency. Well, they weren't worth the paper that they were printed on.
Well, that works for a while until you have a run on the bank, and the word got around that the Mormons didn't have enough capital to really support the currency they were distributing.
And so that expression that you hear from time to time today, phony as a $3 bill, actually has its genesis in the Kirtland Society Bank. There was such a public outcry over the tremendous amount of money that was taken from the people of Kirtland that Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon actually were tarred and feathered, and then they fled to Missouri. Well, that was kind of like going from one pan into another.
People in the different communities didn't want them around. They were seen as a heresy group, a kind of a cult, and voted as a bloc. They weren't sure what their political leanings were. There were also charges of counterfeiting, of illegal transactions or misuse of funds. There were a lot of areas of concern.
And enough so that the people, the Gentiles as they were called, surrounding these different cities and counties got increasingly angered, and so there was violence back and forth. There was violence on both sides. Around that time, a group comes into being that are called the Danites, or Avenging Angels of Death. And they're a Mormon vigilante group that conducts violence on the people surrounding them. All of the violence on both sides was later called the Missouri Mormon War. And one final result of that was that the governor at that time issued something called an extermination order, which basically told the Mormons, get out of Missouri or face severe consequences. And so they did. And that caused them to move to Illinois, to a town that Joseph Smith would later call Nauvoo. Nauvoo was probably the biggest and best of the settlements.
When the Mormons moved to Nauvoo, Illinois, they basically took a swamp and built up a great city there. And they worked very hard, and it was a wonderful, beautiful city, and actually grew to be the largest city in Illinois at that point. It was even larger than Chicago.
Joseph Smith set himself up as the mayor of the town, and
he created his own military unit or paramilitary unit called the Nauvoo Legion.
However, they got about 2,800 men in their militia, so it's about a third the size of the United States Army at that point. This gave concern to the surrounding areas. People were worried, here's this odd cult group led by this man that the community thought was kind of crazy that are raising this army, and they all vote as a bloc. So they could go to politicians and make deals on, I can deliver so many thousands of votes, what are you going to do for me? There were many things that gave people concern about the Mormons.
But behind the scenes, there was actually an evil thing going on that a lot of people didn't know about. Even the Mormons who lived them themselves, was the fact that Joseph Smith and the leaders, other leaders of the Mormon Church at that point, were secretly practicing polygamy.
Now, he first started in polygamy in the 1830s, but it became an open practice in the 1840s at Nauvoo.
One of the problems with this is it had to be kept extremely secret because Illinois had a law in the books against bigamy. So they were worried about being arrested. So in order to keep it secret, Joseph Smith's looking for a way to bind men under a strong enough oath that they wouldn't be talking around about polygamy.
He also, at that time, openly embraced the Freemasonry. At the time that the Nauvoo Lodge was created, there were only 200 Masons in all of Illinois. In a matter of months, virtually every Mormon male in the Nauvoo area became a Mason.
This was a society that took secrecy and oaths very seriously. So I think he thought this might be an avenue for a way of keeping his own men faithful and keeping his secrets.
The way these people were elevated in Masonic rites was, it caused a lot of concern with the main lodge, because when Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery became Masons, they became Masons one day, and then 24 hours later, they became Grand Masons, 33rd degree Masons, which is unheard of. That takes years, decades to grow in Masonic lore and everything. When the Grand Lodge in Illinois heard about this, they threatened to shut down the lodge. In Masonic rites, you have various signs and tokens and handshakes. All or most of these were directly absorbed into the priesthood rituals, the endowment, all of the main rituals of Mormonism, almost without any modification whatsoever. When the Grand Lodge of Illinois discovered that, that was too much for them to bear. They considered Joseph Smith a loose cannon.
So Joseph Smith, when he was bringing up leadership, he would explain to them, and again, this was not taught openly to the general Mormons, but that polygamy was an eternal principle and it needed to be practiced to progress onto godhood. And so as leaderships came up, they would introduce that practice to, and people would agree to it.
When Joseph Smith started practicing polygamy, he didn't just marry young single women, he also was marrying married women that had living husbands. As different ones of his male followers started putting the pieces together and realizing the extent that this was going to, they got considerably concerned that this was just looking like a free-for-all, not something that God would have ordained. Then he started approaching different men in his leadership for their wives. Some accepted this and let him have their wives as a plural wife, but some rebelled. And one of the men that rebelled was a man named William Law. So he and several others rebelled against Joseph's ability to just pick and choose whatever woman he wanted, set up an opposition newspaper that they named the Nauvoo Expositor, exposing his polygamy, exposing his political aspirations, exposing his doctrine of plural gods. And they said in the issue that in coming issues, they were going to get more specific on all these areas. Well, this raised a great concern to Joseph Smith. He was the mayor of Nauvoo, and Joseph Smith, as mayor, declared the press a public nuisance for printing slander.
He had his Nauvoo Legion or some other group come in and destroy the press.
They went out and just pulled the whole thing out in the street and broke it up, smashed it, so that they couldn't do another issue of their paper. They only got one issue out.
And so when that was destroyed, the governor of Illinois said, we cannot allow printing presses or freedom of the speech to be stopped. And this is how Joseph Smith got arrested and was put in the Carthage jail.
Joseph's brother Hiram was also in there, and Mormons smuggled in various weapons to the two of them, including a revolver, clubs, knives.
So when Joseph Smith was in the Carthage jail, he really didn't have any fear because he thought the Nauvoo Legion would come and rescue him, because the Mormons had the largest legion in Illinois at that point. And so it was just a matter of time before he would be rescued. But before the legion got there, there was a mob that gathered outside of the jail.
And so Joseph was basically going to shoot and fight his way out of the jail.
And when the mob came up the stairs, Joseph Smith did open up the door and did shoot until his gun locked up. And I think he shot 3 people. 2 died immediately, and another one, I think, died later on.
He and his brother are trying to get out through a window, and at that point, Joseph Smith issues the Masonic cry for help. Is there no help for the widow's son? And he goes down in a hail of bullets, he and Hiram both.
But that whole concept of the gunfight going on in the Carthage jail was never ever taught to me as a Mormon, that Joseph Smith had a gun or anything, and was never taught to us as a Mormon why he was arrested and what happened with the Nauvoo expositor. That was all left out. It just states that he was arrested and put in jail. And, you know, the fact is that Joseph Smith just didn't stand there and be shot, but he was defending his life. And who came against him, we really don't know. Some people think it was actually Masons that dressed up, because Joseph Smith had actually taken their procedure from the Freemasons and incorporated it into the Mormon temple endowment. But we don't have any empirical evidence of that.
When Joseph Smith died, and his brother with him, it left the Mormon Church with a leadership vacuum.
The Mormons hold a conference because now their prophet is gone. They need a new prophet. Brigham Young comes forward, basically takes control of the conference, and assumes the role as prophet.
Brigham Young is my great-great-grandfather. My mother's maiden name was Young. And so Brigham Young stepped into the role of leader of the church, later proclaimed himself to be a prophet, and was the one that organized the Mormons to leave Illinois to start their trek west. They were looking at coming out to what we now would know as Utah, but they were looking at it because it was not part of the United States. At that point, it was a part of Mexico. And so when the Mormons headed west and came to Utah, they thought they were leaving the United States government. Right after they get here, you have the Spanish-American War, and the United States acquires that territory, and it becomes the territory of Utah, which put the Mormons back in the United States rule. As the Mormons grew in Utah, they sent more and more missionaries out around the world to make more Mormons, and eventually they started saying, you shouldn't come to Utah to gather to Utah, you should stay in your own communities. And so as they sent out missionaries, they started to grow Mormonism in other countries. And at this point, they have their Book of Mormon in, I think, 100 and some odd languages, and they're in more than 150 different countries around the world. So they're a growing presence, a growing missionary effort. Last year, I think they had about 80,000 young missionaries around the world.